Hi, everyone. I see everyone trickling in, so I'll just give it a minute. Hello and welcome to the virtual version of our Curator's Tour of Shift Ecologies of Form, Fashion, and Textiles with Griffin Art Projects Director Lisa Baldissera. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Bahar Mohazemnia, and I'm the Assistant Curator of Engagement here at Griffin Art Projects. Before we begin, we would like to acknowledge that our work takes place on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Tsleil-Waututh and Squamish nations, to whom we are deeply grateful. We would also like to thank the Canada Council for the Arts, BC Arts Council, North Vancouver Recreation and Culture, the Freybe Foundation, and the Michael and Ina O'Brien Foundation for their support towards the exhibition and its surrounding programs. Just a quick housekeeping note before today's presentation. If you would like to see live captions displayed, you can enable this by selecting the CC Live transcription bottom at the bottom of your screen. And lastly, I'll mention that at the very end of today's presentation, there will be a chance for an audience Q&A. So if you have any questions throughout the presentation for Lisa, feel free to type them in the Q&A dialog box. And without further ado, I will introduce Griffin Art Projects Director and Curator of Shift Ecologies, Fashion, Form, and Textile, Lisa Baldissera. Lisa Baldissera has worked in curatorial roles in public art galleries in Western Canada since 1999, including Senior Curator at Contemporary Calgary and Chief Curator of the Mendel Art Gallery in Saskatoon. She was a Curator of Contemporary Art at the Art Gallery of Greater Victoria, where she produced more than 50 exhibitions of local, Canadian, and international artists. She holds MFAs in creative writing from UBC, an art University of Saskatchewan, and a PhD from Goldsmiths College. Baldissera has served on contemporary art juries across Canada and internationally, including the Canada Council for the Arts, Royal Bank Canada Canadian Painting Competition, the Sobey Award, and as a guest of the British Columbia Arts Council Outreach Program. So I will now pass it on to Lisa and the team in the gallery to begin.
Okay. All right. Welcome. And thanks to the people that came out here in person today. So it's wonderful to have you here, and it's wonderful to see the work in person. So I still think it's great for all of you online that you come in person to see the exhibition. We have a couple more weeks left of it till December the 10th. So the exhibition really started out, I was initially working with Janet Werner on her publication and thinking about her work in fashion and textiles, and that's the publication that you see here, Janet Werner Sticky Pictures. And then started thinking about something I think that we all became aware of during the pandemic, which was that supply chain that is giving us all of our materials. And so whether it's clothing or food or materials related to an art practice, we became aware, I think, as a kitchen table conversation of what it meant to be part of a global supply chain every day of our lives. We also are so aware of ecological impacts now with fast fashion and all of the ways that the fashion industry is actually one of the largest contributors to the ecological threats that we're facing today. So it's a really politically significant field, and it's also something that we're engaged with every day. Each of us is making choices as we make choices around what we're going to wear, how we're going to prepare for the day, and then where we're sourcing things from. The really interesting fact that I remember finding out was, you know, with Amazon, if we're ordering things online and they don't fit us and we send them back, they're not necessarily going anywhere but the landfill after that. I mean, it's actually quite shocking. So at the same time, there's beauty and self-expression involved in fashion. And so this is an intersection of contemporary artists looking at fashion, looking at textiles, and looking at some of those larger issues around how we're engaging with them. So I want to just start with Miriam Berntz's piece right here on the wall. So just sort of invite you to have a look at it. So Miriam Burt's actually an emerging artist. She won our Indigenous Emerging Artist Award through Griffin, and she is a landscape architect of Cree heritage and Irish heritage. And she was thinking very much about landscape, family history, and also the association of textiles with certain eras in one's life. So you can see this is actually a family photograph of her with her siblings. And in each of the figures, you can see that there's a textile associated with that person. And it's really interesting, as Miriam was working, she's working primarily as a sculptor, but she would source materials based on her memory of that person in a certain era. So she might find like sheets or curtains from the 90s that reminded her of her mother. This photograph from the 90s, you can see maybe even some patterns that you recognize. That it's interesting how fabric can become an historical record as well. I mean, this also relates to the Russian constructivists, where they actually designed, along with their posters, sculptures, and everything else, they designed fabrics of workers in the fields. So they were really politically consequential. So it's interesting to think about just the pattern itself prompting us to have certain kind of memories about things. So that just keeps flickering along, and you see that she's situated us in this landscape, which very much relates to her practice as a landscape architect. And so she has her own business, and she started to really think about colonization, textile, land as a sort of fusion. And I'm going to just turn to Janet Werner's piece here. So if you can, we'll just switch around a little bit. And it felt like the right placement for this work. It's definitely a bit of a confrontation when you come in the door. And Janet actually is currently being featured as part of a larger exhibition on Picasso and contemporary iterations of Picasso. So you can sort of see how she's reflecting on the history of painting. She has also thinking about how the figure is shaped by fashion. So she's really interested in the kind of architecture of fashion and how someone's figure can be altered or distorted. She is really interested in the emotional quality of these sources. So she looks at fashion magazines and the models. She was really struck by how generic the faces of the models were. So they were sort of easy to kind of wrestle with, like a kind of plasticine. So she really tries to keep moving the paint around in this very liquid way, but she's interested more in the emotional quality of these figures, and also revealing a kind of torsion in how, so that when you're looking at them, you can see that she's actually kind of created those movements and manipulations of the figure, and it's part of the looking. So it's kind of a meeting of art history. You've got that beautiful gray, which is so much like, you know, those early Dutch paintings. When you master that gray, and that becomes a kind of beautiful interstitial space. So you can see that kind of reference to art history in terms of painting, but then also definitely the fashion magazine. She said, even though she doesn't want to be, she's still incredibly impressed by Picasso and his capacity with the figure and what that inventiveness did. So she was thinking about that as well. This piece is called Crisscross. So it definitely has a psychological, but also kind of a comic feeling to it. So she's, you know, she's not afraid to shy away from that, which sometimes, you know, it's maybe difficult to have humor in painting, especially when it's related to these kind of fictional portraits. So, I mean, we rarely see a smiling sitter in a painting, right? So I think that a lot of what she's doing with this is sort of pulling out that quality. And interestingly, the crisscross here is like the crisscross of the eyes. So she does this kind of punning as well with it. The next piece I wanted to show you is China Adams' work. So if you just turn, you can see the work behind you. And China Adams is a conceptual artist. She's influenced by Lawrence Weiner. And the whole idea of conceptualism being sort of staking an idea and not necessarily as concerned with material practice. One of the things that she started to notice was the accumulation of things. Something that most artists struggle with is a storage locker or storing their work. What does it mean to actually be making things, especially in this moment of ecological distress? So it's a sort of similar question where we're thinking about ecologies, we're thinking about those concerns. And what she did was she did an inventory of all the objects in her home. So this work is dated from 1995 and also her studio. So the criteria that she used to decide if they were excess to needs were, had she touched them in a month? Were they going to require any kind of care or technical care? And was she keeping them purely for sentimental reasons? So she identified that 77% of the objects that she had in her studio and in her home were excess. And what she decided to do was remove them and create sculptures out of those excesses. So what you see here is things that have been removed from her home and studio, and it's called the Stitch and Hide project. And so from February to November of 1995, she removed all of 77% of the materials in her personal space to create these. So this is just one. There's actually several of these pieces. And I kind of love looking at them and kind of guessing what they are. I think there were an awful lot of books she wasn't reading, actually, when I look at that. So, and you can see that she also accompanies it with this document. So this is very much like Lawrence Reiner or the conceptual art movement, where you've created a system which you then share. So this reveals the system, this little printout here on the wall. So I'm going to move now to Philip Lackenman behind me. So
can I ask you something?
Yeah.
Like, is it like, did she that she wanted to install it on the floor?
Yes, that's part of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, everything about it. So the glass kind of removes it. It's very interesting too, when you think about the language. So on the one hand, these are everyday objects. She's formalized them. I mean, she didn't stitch them in all kinds of multicolor fabrics. She's very much a minimalist. Like if you look at the way she's done it, what we're aware of now is the line of the stitch, the separation of the lines, the stack. Look at how symmetrical that is. So she's still aestheticizing this. She's created this kind of system, again, with that. And then each of them is covered by a box like that. So she's not afraid to still flag that this is art. Now, she's more recently, since Hurricane Katrina, she started thinking even more about ecology, the excess, looking at how many people's homes were destroyed and how much, that those personal objects became kind of at the whim of this ecological disaster. And she's now working purely, she just said, I'm not going to even wrestle with objects anymore. So now her art practice is purely meditation and contemplation on positive thinking. So she's completely removed objects from her work now. Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, it's interesting to think of that as the end game of conceptual art, and also for any of us that have art collections, that have art in our lives, what does that mean to be storing it? What does that, it's an interesting ethical question now, especially for artists producing. So, yeah. In fact, I heard Mary Oliver recently interviewed, well, before her death, and someone was talking about her simplicity of her poetry, and they said, why introduce more words into the world than you need to? It's really interesting to think about it conceptually. So, Philip Lackenman, this is an image. So he's a Berlin artist based between Los Angeles and Berlin, background in model making, art history, film. He's really interested in what it means to have objects that kind of have a history surrounding them, and thinking about how that understanding of them changes as you go through decades. So I'm thinking about the fact that I saw the Mona Lisa in 1987, like my first grand tour, and what that meant to stand in front of that painting in 1987, before digital, before really even that sort of cultural kind of highway of everybody having access to being able to fly everywhere. So I was standing in front of that painting with 4 other people. There was no glass over it. There was just a little stanchion. So now we have this kind of technology around inserting ourselves into those environments. So the last time I went with my son, which was about, I don't know, 8 years ago, there was about 400 people in the room. The Mona Lisa was no longer next to the other paintings by Da Vinci. It was behind glass. And there was such a flicker across the sea of 400 people because they were all taking photographs despite the sign that said no flash photography, it was just like a spectacle. And I thought, this is no longer the experience that I had. So if you think about this kind of anachronistic nature of our experiences with ourselves, people in our lives, our historical objects, it's constantly changing. We're no longer, we never were really in a fixed state. So he's really interested in that kind of re-encounter. So this particular work is thinking about one artwork by Gerhard Richter. So it's Betty, which is done in the 80s. This is Richter's photorealist painting of his daughter. And you can see the detail in the sweater. Betty's facing away. It's something Janet Werner talks about in her work. What does it mean to have a gaze refused? We're always looking for faces. So Lachenmann does this sort of restorative project. So he has Betty, now called Christina. So it's Betty / Christina, looking toward us. So there's a revelation. So already there's a change in this. It's not a painting. I mean, Richter was, that was one of his inventions, was to introduce photorealism, part of his training in Eastern Europe, his Soviet realist training. So it was really an important part of the way he resituated our understanding of painting at that time, because he moved so easily between photorealism and abstraction. That was his gift in the 80s of saying, actually, we don't have to have fidelity to representation or abstraction. We can move between these two. So it's a really important painting because of that, where it's situated art historically. So Philip Lachenmann recreates the sweater. So he painted the sweater, then had this fabric remade. So he had the exact fabric for the sweater. So that's one of the conceptual parts of this piece. The other is when we think about, so we have Betty, you can see light in this image. You can see that even though it's a neutral background, it's filled with light. It's suffused with light that you could see all over her, the sweater, the back of her head, and even in that space. So look what happens with photography. The photo eye can only do so much with tone. And that's one of the things, of course, that Manet and the Post-Impressionists was really interested in, is this lack of capacity for subtle tone in photography. There was always that drop off in the darks. So when you look at Manet, you can see that, that really strong tonal kind of quality in his work. So there's this reference to a kind of change that photography brings to painting. It's really interesting. The other thing is, all of us have seen those sort of early mid-Renaissance paintings where the figure has a kind of maybe like a little cement wall or something they're leaning on, and then you see them come into your space because their sleeve falls over the wall. So it's like a classic orientation. Look what he does. Her finger is right at the edge of the picture plane. So he's really kind of playing with that sense. She's sitting right at the edge of the picture plane. That's not what Betty's doing. So he's really expanding this notion into a whole set of operations that are involved with photography, photography's impact on painting's history, and then this wonderful little kind of conceit of remaking this fabric. So it's a really interesting hinge, that fabric. So we're going to move from that piece, and we're going to look at this work here by Annette Kalm. And there's two works actually by Annette in this exhibition, and we'll just start with this one. So if you, Annette Kalm is really interested in the history of textiles. She uses them as still lives, but here you can also see this kind of reference to minimalism and post-minimalism. So there's all kinds of, there's Bridget Riley, there's Agnes Martin. I mean, the line has its own art history. So it's really interesting the way that from Philip Lachenmann, we have, this is a close-up photograph of fabric. So you can see that the fold and the line also make reference to textiles moving through space, because of course we know that this is part of a global industry. The movement of textiles is like, that's a constant movement. So a fold, a seam like this, a fold like this, these are all the things that we try to get rid of when something arrives by Amazon. I hope not, but you know, in our front door, we're trying to remove the elements of that kind of the shipment. So it's a really interesting, when you think about Bridget Riley's movement or Karen Davey, and this movement is coming from a globalized entity, an actual piece of fabric that's moved through the world to arrive at our doorstep. So it's a really interesting hinge between aesthetics, formalism, and even architecture in some ways. If you think about the use of striping as a kind of conceit to conceal certain architectural elements, that's also something that's used in design. So we'll look here at Annette's second work. So she also, you can see that she's very formal in her approach. And here you can see something like the aesthetics of advertising photography. So there's no horizon line. These objects are floating in space. And these are a series of caps that she found when she was in New York in Chinatown. And she kept finding them. And they were like this fusion of a classical Chinese cap, a woven cap, and a baseball cap. And they're quite ubiquitous. And so every time she found them, she would buy one and then just photograph it from several different angles. So it's a very neutral gaze in a way, but it's also highly aestheticized. So we know it's coming to us again from the idea of, you know, situating something for fashion, but also archiving. What does it mean to, you know, just in a very deadpan way, order and archive this very really banal object? Like it's an object that's kind of, you know, almost disposable in a way. So it's to give it this kind of attention, to elevate it, also speaks to this sort of fusion of that globalized culture around fashion, and also a kind of language. Like we can see that there's a language that's being used. It reminds me of seeing an installation of chairs at a design museum, and it was 500 years worth of chairs, and they were just hung on the wall. It was everything from a Renaissance chair to like an Italian futurist chair. And so what you could see was the language kept changing, but there were these architectural elements to it that just remained the same. So this is similar. We see something moving through time and space, creating a kind of, has a kind of hybridity as it keeps moving through time and space. But, and then it's also incredibly intimate. We need a cap, you know, we need to be sheltered from the sun. We need something that's affordable. So it's something that's is loaded with all kinds of consequences and histories, and yet it's really everyday, something that we're constantly interacting with as we go through. So I'm just going to look at Robert Eude's work here. And this is a more recent work. Robert Eude is a Victoria artist, and this work is, he's very interested in the urban fabrics. He's interested in the city, in light, in the way, some of you might have seen his offsite project in Vancouver, and it was a series of glass works. So he's really interested in that refraction of light on glass, and how we're constantly moving through kind of a cinematic movement when we're going through the city. You're walking through the city. None of us cannot be, let's face it, let's be honest, none of us are not self-conscious anymore. We've seen our face too many times on Zoom calls, selfies, like we are always inserted into whatever location that we're in now. So he's really interested in that. And also the language. So you can see here, we've got felt, plexiglass, kind of discarded insulation and building materials. And then they've got this kind of hip quality, like a necklace or luggage tag or swatches for paint. So it's just this really beautiful movement between something that's in our, you know, something that's like detritus and cast off, and then something that's highly aestheticized. So he'll, you know, you can see he's put a painted surface here with some glitter, an arrow. So they're almost like paintings on a chain too. If you wanted to wear a set of paintings, he's created a maquette for us to think about it. So, you know, the way he implies the body, but he also implies this larger urban space in which all these materials are found, in which we're, again, constantly thinking about what is our responsibility, what are the ethics of the materials that we're constantly engaging with. So we'll go into the next room, and I'm just going to look at the Robert Rauschenberg work here. So we are so incredibly fortunate to be able to see a work by Robert Rauschenberg. due to the generous lending of a private collector. And this work is part of his Hoarfrost series that he did in the mid-70s. He was working on lithograph printmaking, and he noticed that the rag that he was using to wipe the stone was constantly printing with an image, and he loved it. He loved the way that looked, and he wasn't interested in narrative as part of his work. He was very much interested in bringing objects into the same world that we live in, the everyday. So even the current, which I was a little bit worried about, this movement, this current, is actually part of what he imagines for the work, that the work is unframed, it's tacked with these pins. There's this kind of delicacy and ephemerality about it. And it's also a collage. You can see that there's paper attached. This series, Hoarfrost, it's about the kind of mist. If any of you are from the prairies, you know what hoarfrost looks like. So that mist that when the air meets a cold object. So it just kind of gives it a beautiful kind of frayed feeling. So he's very interested in how he refers to Dante's Inferno. Dante speaks about hoarfrost in that whole narrative. So he's really thinking about, you know, almost these kind of grand forms. Like there's very much, if you look at this, even though he hasn't been interested in history, we know that these are residues of a certain moment from the 1970s. We can't get away from it. So the newspaper, the print, even the way things are put together, the way that these objects pair. So you can see this kind of mirroring of the two objects, the cardboard box. So all of these things still take us back to a certain moment in time. It's kind of interesting when we think about Philip Lacaman. So in 1975, when this work was first seen, we might not have thought about it as an archive. You would have thought of it very, very formally the way he wanted to. But now, this many years later, we're encountering the work and we're thinking about all of the ways that the work holds history, despite his lack of interest in it. So I'm just going to look over here at the Ulrich Horndash work. So he was very interested in the kinds of tactics of Bauhaus, where you would be working through fabric, design, architecture, but he was also really interested in the idea of the flag. So you see the dimension of this really reflects the flag. You can actually, when you get up close, see the stitching, so you can actually see the cross. So he really looks at this kind of classic heraldic imagery just to see what it's made of. So what are the things that prompt us to think about it as a flag? So you can see that it's black on black, which is very much like Jasper Johns' experiments when we're thinking about the early black painting. Malevich, Kazimir Malevich comes to mind. So there's all kinds of art historical references. But then he also is thinking about architecture and what does it mean for, in terms of nationalism and sloganism. This is a kind of shorthand that a flag means so much. And we know from all kinds of contemporary political history that a flag can be so loaded with so much responsibility, but he just neutralizes it and asks us to think about it purely as a formal object. And, you know, you think about Grandma Moses, you know, sewing the first flag. We don't really think about flags as sort of intimate textile objects. They're infused with a kind of rigidity. So it's so interesting that he's made this a rigid flag. It almost shows that crystallization that happens around political sloganism. So by making the flag, you know, from a lovely supine material that might be draped on the flagpole to this rigid form, he refers to both painting, but also maybe those crystallizations of doctrine. So it's a really beautiful kind of piece in that way. And then Wolfgang Tillmans to the right of this scale is quite beautiful. So he's a German artist working, very interested in darkroom, still working with darkroom technologies. And he's also interested in sort of decentering the gaze. These are almost like still lives. And his installations will, you know, usually have all kinds of different scales of photographs in them. They'll be arranged at all different levels on a wall. You'll be really walking into a room that functions as a kind of archive of the everyday. So he became quite famous in the 80s because he was just photographing his friends, sort of the parties that were happening at the time, but it gradually turned itself into an archive because he was photographing things that were happening at the same time as the Berlin Wall was falling, as the AIDS crisis was unfolding. So even though these are quite subtle, generic still lives, they are located and they locate us in a certain place and time. So, but not in a didactic way. So it's very, very gentle. And I loved that these two gloves were kind of hanging there so vulnerably in the midst of this grid of that, what looks like a kind of studio window. And then you've got almost the mist on the window, almost a hoarfrost. So there was some really nice relationships between the grids and the Robert Rauschenberg, and then that mist that comes up here. So that, again, we see sort of this language of blurring in both the Rauschenberg and in the Tillman's work. So I'm going to look at the Brian Youngen works. And these are sort of two sides of a series that Brian Youngen did. One, the early one from 2005, which I think a lot of us are familiar with this series. So Brian Youngen is of Denizah heritage, and he's very interested in the commodification of indigenous forms. And so looking at the Air Jordans, he was finding ways to just sort of fuse the history of that object, of that commercialized object that was also sutured to the history of a specific person, Michael Jordan, and kind of retaining a lot of the qualities of the face. Again, like Janet Werner is interested in how much information do we need before we see a face. So here he's, really playing with our desire to look in and see in that mimetic quality, almost a data quality, the kind of forms of consumer culture, but also then we have these odd sinuous lines that are there that really think they remind us of like the form line of Coast Salish design. So there's all of these kinds of intersections that happen in this work. Then he revisits it 10 years later. And so for the second work, you can see that he's allowing the architecture of the shoe itself to be the armature. So he's not adding anything to this. So we have, the actual lines of the soles of the heels that form that basis. We have, again, the kind of that reference to the Salish form line, this exploded work. And here he's much more, this one he was sort of unstitching carefully. This one he would take a saw, he would be just much less precious about how he was approaching this work. And it has, again, this sort of beautiful quality at the same time as he's paying attention to all the capacities of that original material and then exploding this form. So it's, I think about the movement from here to here, where he's actually testing our capacity to think of this as a mask-like figure. So it's interesting to see something revisited 10 years apart. Just going to go over to Liz Magor's work and Manuel Mathieu. So Manuel Mathieu is a Haitian-Canadian artist, and he is trained, came to Montreal at the age of 19, and he was born right when the Duvalier dictatorship was ending. So there was a sort of history of trauma from that dictatorship. And also, Haiti is the oldest Black republic, 200-year-old republic. So he was thinking about the kind of history of Haitian art as well as Western art. And he thought about how to have the kind of the sensitivities, the lack of durable kind of quality of these burned kind of forms. Instead of creating paintings that are meant to last forever, I know when this arrived, we were a bit worried because we saw these elements dangling. There was this kind of fragility. And he said, no, that's intended. I want this work to incorporate that kind of, in a way, it's an interrogation of the persistence of time, of especially painting. I mean, painting's such a historian over time of power relations. Like painting is one of the first spaces where, well, I won't say first, one of the core spaces where a kind of Western art history took hold. And so to actually pull that idea of permanence apart by using the materials really for Manuel Mathieu references the kind of spiritual, intuitive forms of Haitian art making with this kind of Western form. So he's just thinking across those lines. I think that also relates to these sort of chalk marks, like these are kind of anti-archival moves in the work. And I think it's really powerful to think about these. And also, you know, when you think about the history like Jules Olitsky, where the edge of the painting was really important. So he's got all of these kind of chops that he's bringing in, and then he's undoing them. So it's a really, you know, still very lush painting, but then troubled at the same time. He calls this one storyteller. And it's a bit different because often his works will have sort of one image space, but this one has 3 distinct image spaces. And I think about them as a kind of abstract storyboard, that's how he's really approaching it. And yet, you know, next to the Rauschenberg, we can kind of see where the newspaper gives us a world, he gives us almost a map. I mean, I think it's a really beautiful line that you might think about this as a kind of bird's eye view of some place, some imaginative place, as yet unmapped. And I think that's interesting in relation of colonization, and mapping is one of the first ways to take hold of a space, is to generate its limits, its boundaries, its geographic forms. It's quite powerful. And this one, much more like looking upward to the sky. So, you know. So I'm going to look here at Liz Magor's work, and similarly attending to detail. So Liz Magor is well known for her casting, her careful casting of objects. It's just superb in its detail. And one of the things she talks about with the casting process is its slowness. So as she is carefully making these casts, she's coming to know the work, every detail of the work, because she has to ensure that it's been represented in this cast. So she talks a little bit about kind of the exquisiteness of the everyday, like just even the folds of the edges, these kinds of creases. I mean, we've got a little bit of a touching of the kind of history for this object. The glove itself also cast, and then an actual object that's here. So we have this sort of, what does it mean to duplicate something that's already in the world, to make it a copy of itself? What is the feeling of it is almost to reinvest it with time, especially in a kind of consumer culture that's so rapid, to actually take something that should be a discard and thrown away, and then reinvest it with something that's precious, a kind of feeling of preciousness and attention, because suddenly I'm paying attention to this and paying attention to the gestures of the fringe, to the gestures of the wrinkle, to all of these kinds of, you know, thinking back to the Combine of Robert Rauschenberg, his early assemblages. So it travels through art history, but it also tells us that, you know, it's the Dada move. Anything can be invested with a kind of beauty or purpose, and conceptual life too. So we're going to just go across to look at more of Janet Werner's work. And we'll look at the little ones first. So Janet says she really enjoys these because they are sort of more at the level of the page, the tear out. So these really take us back to the fashion magazines, but then they also take us to abstraction, because really she's constantly thinking about the history of painting. So if you look on the left side, you can see that there's a figure there, but we also see, she did a series of works that involved these kind of collages in her studio that were stuck together with little pieces of tape. So that little green square is actually where the tape was put together to bring together this sort of background for the image. So she really is thinking about it as a constructivist. How are images constructed? What's that kind of material quality of putting something together? So as much as it's about the fashion and that armature that fashion design gives us, it's also about the history of painting. And if we look at the piece behind us, there's all kinds of mirroring going on, literally. Is this figure in space with us or reflected in the mirror? There's this kind of painting palette that's set out below. the staging with the curtain, and then a refusal of the gaze. It's really interesting to think about these sunglasses in relation to Brian Youngin's work. Like, how does that sort of refusal happen? So we've sort of can imagine that we're standing in front and this is a reflection, but we can also imagine this as a kind of figure that's kind of risen out of the ashes from the painter's palette. It's quite funny in a way. So, and yet it's got all of the lushness of this painting history. There are all of these sort of areas of abstraction in the painting and staging. So it's quite a, I mean, it's quite a theatrical work. And then we can see where she uses the distortions of the figures again, the elongation of the neck, anything to create a little bit of a discomfort and about a received image. So we're going to go to look at Jason Dodge's work here. And so Jason Dodge did a series called Above the Weather, and he traveled to 12 different countries, and he asked weavers from each country to create a yarn, a woven yarn that was approximately 12 kilometers, which was the distance from the surface of the earth right up to cloud cover, the topography of cloud, where the weather actually takes place. And he asked them to dye, each craftsperson was invited to dye the fabric, the color of the night sky where they were. So this is just such a beautiful conceptual project, but he's very much a storyteller. So he has this very long title for it. I'm going to read it to you actually. So this is from Armenia. So in Yerevan, Tumanyan, Armenia, Anyek Voskanyan wove woolen yarn, the color of nighttime sky and the length from the earth to above the weather. And so he asked us not to include any other material description in our label or the year. So it's something that kind of comes up is in the exhibition is the kind of return to crafts, to the kind of pre-industrial crafts, pre-industrial skills. And in this one, he's really giving the instructions conceptually to the weaver, very much like when we think about the conceptual work of China Adams. So here we're giving the instructions to the weaver, and the weaver creates the piece and then really bundles it for us. There's this formality. So he's sort of borrowing them from the vernacular of the weaver's language of just creating a bundle, a neat bundle, and a grid. So all of that, again, we see the grid, we see the line like we did in the work next door. So these formal languages kind of get lifted up. And then if you look at Liz Magor's work, you can see again how that line functions. So very much like Brian Youngin's line functions, the line in the Jason Dodge. Now we see line and line that's carefully preserved. This is the purpose of this object, was to preserve these very kind of throwaway design features of an everyday object, something that we're not even looking at anymore in terms of its design features. So you can see to create those buckles, those pockets, those wrinkles, the tear on the edge, and then a little bit of a narrative here with the craft dinner on the floor. So, you know, what do these kind of, I want to say debased, but it's like an object that's, it's been made precious, but it's also a sign of something that's not necessarily, it's been invested as an art form into something that we should look at again. So it's something we should keep looking at and keep wondering why, like China Adams says, do we need more objects in the world if we can't attend to the ones that we already have? So that one asks us to look and look again. And similarly with the Medri McPhee work here, Medri McPhee started this series of paintings. She was very much a painter that dealt with landscape and representation, and she just decided that she would throw a sock in one of her paintings at one point and just see what happened. And so she said it was like a breach. So she just sort of threw open the language of painting as she'd been using it. And so she started to pay attention to the way that these materials were formed. So you have, you know, if you look closely, you can see how the architecture is based on how she's sewn together. So she's taken apart cast off, you know, the clothing from cast off clothing from friends, from vintage stores, and then taken it all apart and then reorganized this as the surface for her painting. So we see all of the lines, if you get a little bit closer, that you can see and recognize things that have been repurposed, the zippers, the bra, the lines, the textures, and then they form the foundation for the abstraction, which she said would be very hard for her to do on her own. She's always been looking for the image. But the other part she felt was kind of in stealth mode, very much like Liz Magor is holding this throwaway that would have ended up in a landfill back up in terms of art and art historical meaning. So the preciousness of the painting and a painting's history, which says, value this object, look closer. So she also with these, there's another painting, but with this one, the more monochromatic, she started to think about it as music. So these kind of low notes, those sort of dark forms become a kind of low note. And she thinks of sort of percussion and rhythm and pattern, but also musicality with the work. So I'm just going to go into the other room here. And so we'll just start with this vitrine, which is showing the work of Jae-woo Kang, who did a residency at Griffin Art Projects in the summertime. And he's very interested in a kind of futuristic look at thinking about ecology. But so he created these kind of figures. And the starting point was from this was his background's film. So he was really interested in costume design for film. He's a graduate of SFU, and this started him thinking about creating his own props and costumes that really reshape. If you think about, Janet Werner talks about how fashion can reshape the body. So some kinds of forms of tailoring. If you think about Steve McQueen's fashion, Alexander McQueen's fashion, where you can see how tailoring actually reshapes the body in that work. So he was interested in that, but he also sort of floats them over these existing figures. So we had a fashion show at the night of the opening, and one of the gestures, the choreography was to very slowly have each of the models dress each other in a kind of really agonizing, attenuated gesture. So this slowness was really about thinking about time, thinking about performance, and for him, thinking about a kind of futurity. So you can see they start off with these kind of the 18th century, which he said the women in this industrial moment in the 18th century had to make like an absurd amount of them in one day. They had to do them so quickly. And he said it took him like several days to make one shirt. And I think the women had them down to maybe 40 or 50 a day. So it really speaks to this kind of pre-industrial labor. And then each of them, so one of them, the models, Nico, her figure was as Beyonce, Kate as Joan of Arc, Farisa as Tristan from Tristan and Isolde, and William Beckford was one of the models, Yongo, and Jeanette as Jack Shepherd. So some of these are literary figures and some of them are pop culture figures. Each of them wore these masks. This is which just makes me laugh. So it's duct tape, but he also grew the crystals as part of the 4 months that he was in residency. So you see it's a little bit like Jules Verne and the, meters under the, however many thousands of meters under the sea. It's like he's created this thing that will never go away. That duct tape is never going to disintegrate, So he's really speaking about, again, those ecological concerns. And then these kind of remote figures with these tiny little eyes that are, when you were looking at them, you could imagine that they could even navigate the exhibition space, the models. And he made all of these. So everything was made in that 4-month residency. And these are just some examples of it. So I'm just going to look to the Olaf Hosefield work, which is on the far end here. And this again is looking back. So he is trained as an architect, a German artist, and there's a wooden armature on which this rests. And this is a traditional German Polish form of binding, hemp binding. So it's including all kinds of natural materials. He worked with farmers and craftspeople to learn this technique, but then also work with them to actually help them make the works. So he sort of harkens back to a moment of making, but also I think in this work, as with some of the other works, what are the sources? We feel so divorced from the sources of our fashion. Like, where do they come from? It feels so abstract now. So this kind of takes us back to that moment, that pre-industrial, pre-modern moment. And actually so interesting that this has persisted as a form. People still know this, they still know how to make this, to do this kind of binding technique. And then of course, abstract expressionism, you can see all of the painterly kinds of qualities of it. There's a rhythm, so we can imagine, you know, if Jackson Pollock had met Anselm Kiefer, this is might have happened, you know. So it's a beautiful language based on minimalism. Like, it's still there, but it also takes us back to source. And I think that's a really interesting way to think about Christiane Lohr's work, which is this little seed bag. It's called Little Seed Bag. These are called light paintings, the holes of fell. And the little seed bag is actually dandelion seeds. So if you think about her work, so this teardrop where she gathers, her background is archaeology. So it's really interesting how she's thinking about, you know, if you think about an archaeology, to discover a seed that's 500 or 1,000 years old might actually tell you something about an agricultural history. Like, it's actually a really powerful thing. So for her, she looked at what the capacities, the mark-making capacities of these seeds were, these dandelion seeds, and then she creates this congregate image where they look like they've just naturally come together. It's almost like a magnetic force. But that teardrop is something that she's just, it's a little net bag that she's carefully created. So it sort of hovers between the architectural and the natural form. And next to it is a piece by Merit Oppenheim, and it's called, there's a German translation for it. I am a swaddled child, swaddled with an iron grip. And it's from 1995, the year that she died. I love the patterning. When you have a moment to look up closer, there's this very sort of light mark making pattern, this kind of vaginal form into which this phrase of absolute control is written. The swaddling cloth is our first outfit, you know? So I loved that this was sort of a counterpoint to think about how that encounter with that first bit of fabric, that first bit of textile forms us and introduces us to the world. I mean, when the baby is born, that's the first thing that we do. It's like the movement from nature to culture is to swaddle the baby. So it's just quite a beautiful piece. There's another work by Robert Rauschenberg from the same Hoarfrost series behind. And then I'm going to just move here and talk a little bit about Dwayne Linklater's work. You can see additionally Manuel Matou, an earlier kind of experiment with the burnt fabric, and then also Janet Werner, who takes us through this kind of juxtaposition. So here you can see the collage in her studio and what happens. So this is called Strasse. So we've got a torn image placed on a background of a further image, and then just painted together as a holistic object. So that fragmentation kind of moves out of the architecture of the outfit and then into the painting itself. Dwayne Linklater's work, this is a piece from an exhibition at Catriona Jeffries, I think almost 10 years ago now. And the fabric is a linen fabric, and the pink dye, so he's created it in a width that could go through a photocopy machine. So this is actually a JPEG. You can see the digital version of it. That sort of pixelation that's happening. And he's photocopied it over 20 times. He's run it through the machine. And it's actually a poem from Mary Ann Aquast, who was an activist who was originally a Mi'kmaq from Nova Scotia, and she traveled to be part of the American Indian movement. In the 70s, moved to the States and was murdered. And so this is a story he came across in the New York Times, because at that point it was an unsolved murder. It's since been solved. But she was this very powerful figure in you know, coming into this political activism in the 70s, and then creating this is her poem that he's also not allowing us to read. So it's kind of the right to opacity. And this is an Edouard Glissant term. The right to opacity is the right not to be seen, the right not to reveal culturally, the right to withhold, so that not everything is there for consumption culturally. So it's actually a really beautiful example of that kind of withholding. And then the color pink is really interesting because the history of this color, and this is hand dyed, is a kind of, it's a Mexican, between the 17th and 18th century, there was the Spanish discovered this Mexican dyeing, a dye that was kind of a beautiful, vibrant dye that would produce the reds and the purples. And so of course, all the royalty, the Catholic Church, everyone wanted access to this dye. And it was one of the first kind of globalized moments of something related to this kind of indigenous production that is then kind of used and exported over a series of 200 years. So it's kind of one of the first examples of that extraction. Yes, that's it. Yeah, yeah. Well, thank you everybody for coming today. I really appreciate your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions if you have any questions at all. So, yes.
So I'm curious about the curating process, like all of the works together as one single topic. I mean, I know about the topic, but how all those.
Yeah, well, the mandate of Griffin is, oh, yeah. So what was the curatorial premise that drew all the works together? And the mandate of Griffin is to show private collections to the public. And that's showing what's available here. This is a local collector. And then I've drawn also from artist studios. And it was really trying to expand this over different material practices. So I was really interested in everything from photography to performance to sculpture, and how it's definitely embedded in a contemporary art practice. None of these people are trying to enter high fashion production. So it allows a kind of slowness, which I really enjoyed in all of the work. So you're really thinking about the material property of this thing which appears before you. What are its histories? What are its precedents? What does it index and where does it point to next in terms of a future? So it felt to me like working across history too, that there were many opportunities from the 70s right up to the present to think about this slipstream of knowledge that all of us encounters, because we all are part of it. We're embodied, so we have a sensorium when we look at these things that we immediately respond to them. So, yeah, David. Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. Also part of what you're thinking about, or is it just color? So the question is, did I intend to do a monochrome or a limited palette in this work? And actually, I did not intend it. I really was looking at each individual piece, but I think that may come from that background of production, because many of them are really situating the original material in its original form, like the Hulsapfel, what Manuel Mathieu is doing with his burnt, they're naturally appearing kinds of things. The Christian Lore, that's the color of the dandelion seed. So I think some of them are just coming from that. Like even this bright pink is actually quite interesting if you think about the history of that dye. So it just happens to have this vibrant capacity, which was why it was so sought after, because it's unusual that it has that capacity. And so, yeah, so in that sense, no, I was just really letting the artist take the lead, and this is where I got to. Any other questions at all? Yeah.
How did you transport that dandelion piece?
Well, the collector actually brought it here to us very carefully, but you see that there's a few little seeds at the bottom, and that I think is new. So, yeah, it'd be very difficult to care for. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, everyone. So great to spend the afternoon with you, and I hope you get up to the open studios. I'm going to remind you that the Combine Art Fair is going to be happening December 8th, 9th, and 10th at the residency. So if you want to come and look at ever more art, you're most welcome. Love to see you there. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you for joining us on this online platform for Lisa Baldissera's tour. And just another reminder that our next event is the Combine Art Fair with the opening reception December 8th from 7 to 10 p.m. And Combine Art Fair is returning to us for the third year now, featuring two new Vancouver-based galleries, Afternoon Projects and Pale Fi Projects, a Los Angeles-based gallery, Royale Projects, alongside the founders, Griffin Art Projects, Monocare's Gallery, Unit 17, and WAP. And just a reminder that the Shift exhibition does run until December 10th. And if you're in Vancouver, the open studios will be open until 5 today. Thank you, everyone.